In this final slide deck, I want to talk about some of the new features that you'll find in Windows Server 2012. So we'll talk about Server Core, the minimal server user or the minimal server interface, Hyper-V 3.0, which is their new hypervisor that comes with Server 2012, PowerShell, storage spaces, resilient file system or REFS, and the IP management and dynamic access control. So let's start with Server Core. I talked about Server Core before, but basically Server Core provides a minimal user interface environment. When I say a minimal user interface environment, notice that the word graphical is missing from there. So this is a user interface that only allows management from the command shell or from the command line. So you have to use the PowerShell to manage the server remotely or even from the server, but you can also manage it remotely with other tools that we talked about. So I talked about the management console and server manager. Those tools can be pointed remotely to the server that's running Server Core, but if you actually connect to the console on the server running Server Core, you will not find any of those tools and you cannot install those tools. You can simply use the command line, and that's pretty much it. So that's Server Core. Why do people use this? Because it's very small installation and it doesn't use a lot of resources for the user interface. You're saving those resources for other things. So, for example, Microsoft says you can have a little more than 5 gigabytes of disk space to install Server Core. Although, to be fair, Linux can do it without less, but we won't talk about that. So a major enhancement in Windows Server 2012 Server Core is the ability to switch between Server Core mode and GUI mode. So you can theoretically go to the GUI mode if you needed to, if you decided that you needed the GUI. The minimal server interface, so if you go back to 2008 and earlier, in 2008 and earlier, by default, Microsoft Windows Server was a full desktop environment. So you had a start menu, you had the little clock, and you had, all of the stuff you would expect even on a workstation. So really, a server really wasn't much different than a workstation as far as the GUI was concerned. They pretty much looked the same. It might have been, not as pretty, but, it didn't have all the cool features that you have in the Windows desktop environment, but it was still roughly the same thing. In fact, many people ran a server operating system as their desktop if they were a system administrator because they had all those tools and they could do some testing and things like that. But with starting with 2012, it's a pretty minimal interface. It's very simple now. There really is no start menu anymore. You basically get the server manager and some control panel applets and the MMC, and it does not include a taskbar. There's no desktop, no Internet Explorer, no File Explorer, the start screen. All of that stuff goes away by default with the minimal server interface. Now you can install all these things. So you can have a desktop and Internet Explorer and all that stuff if you want on a server, but by default, you don't have those things. So the command prompt and the PowerShell are available, which is important. You need those for management, but again, you could also use those remotely. So Hyper-V, the new version of Hyper-V that comes with Server 2012, it supports multiple concurrent live migrations, replicas, which are basically exact copies of a virtual machine. It supports 32 virtual processors, virtual machines with up to 512 gigs of RAM, so you can have 512 gigs of RAM in a VM. Clusters up to 63 nodes. Enhanced virtual networking, so they have soft networking as software, and it's a little better than it was in the older version. Virtual disks up to 16 terabytes. So lots of enhancements in Hyper-V 3.0, and really makes it a viable competitor to things like VMware. So that's really kind of what Microsoft's looking to compete with that product. The PowerShell has some additional functionality. PowerShell came out as part of 2008, but in 2012 it certainly has a lot more functionality. So they use the term commandlets to describe commands and scripts. So there are hundreds of commandlets that are available in PowerShell that let you do common tasks like managing Active Directory, for example. Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8.1, 7, Windows 10 all have PowerShell included with them. So you have those tools available. So some of the enhancements that you'll find in 2012, there's 50 new commandlets, JOD scheduling commandlets, language enhancements, remote module import, module auto loading, enhanced command auto completion, simplified command discovery, improved performance. There were some issues with the PowerShell prior to 2012 that a lot of these were kind of cleaned up in 2012. It really made it into a solid tool in 2012. The PowerShell is pretty powerful. I mean, you can do a lot of interesting things with the PowerShell. One of the things I found that I can do with it is I can write VB.NET code right in the PowerShell, and it compiles it on demand. So you can do some pretty powerful scripting and automation with the PowerShell that simply wasn't possible with the old command line. What we all think of as the DOS command line, for example. So it does give you a lot of functionality. This is Microsoft's answer to, in the Linux world, you have shell scripting. So this is really equivalent to shell scripting in the Linux and Unix world. To some extent, I have to say some of it's a little bit more powerful than shell scripting. In the Linux and Unix world, if you really want to write powerful scripts in the shell, what you end up doing is writing C or C++ code and compiling it, which you can certainly do, but you might as well just compile programs at that point. With the PowerShell, it can do compile on demand with .NET and things like that. So it definitely gives you a lot of functionality. So it's a neat tool to have. Another enhancement is storage spaces, which allows virtual drives to give you a platform for creating volumes and storage pools that you can dynamically expand, and they are fault tolerant. So volumes can be created from multiple drive types, and this is also important for private cloud. So this is another piece that Microsoft added that really makes them a viable contender in the private cloud market space. So it allows thin provisioning. I would call thin provisioning sort of over provisioning or overloading, which basically allows you to provision disk space, but it doesn't actually use the physical space until you need it, right? So you can, if you have a 100 gig drive, you can give everyone, you can give 100 users 5 gigs apiece, and it'll work because it's not going to actually use that space until somebody actually needs it. So it allows you to over allocate so that most users aren't going to use all that space, but the ones that do can still use it. But certainly, of course, when the physical disk runs out of space, you have to handle that. But that is a nice feature. They also added the resilient file system, which is a new file system. NTFS was really the only option in Windows all the way up to 2008. So starting in 2012, they came out with the resilient file system, which is still available today in 2016. It's backwards compatible to NTFS. NTFS doesn't go away though, so we still have to have NTFS because you can't have a boot volume on REFS. So you do have to have NTFS for the boot volume, which means your primary partition that has Windows installed still has to be NTFS. But you can use REFS for your very large volume. And that's really what it's designed for. It's designed for the huge volumes. NTFS was pretty good, but it seemed to fall apart with really large volume disks because of the way it manages the file system. So REFS is sort of optimized to work on those huge file systems. And prior to REFS, with NTFS, it was designed back in the days when I think a 1 terabyte hard drive was nearly unthinkable back in 1990. So, but today that's common. You can go to Best Buy today and you can buy a 1 terabyte drive. So Microsoft needed to come up with a technology to more efficiently handle these huge volumes. So REFS is the answer for that. So that's one of the new features. They also added the IP address management, which is a new feature, which allows you to monitor and manage servers. This is a tool that was prior to 2012. A lot of this you would do with tools like SolarWinds and third-party tools that are now sort of baked into the operating system in Microsoft. So, and Microsoft seems to do a pretty good job of seeing all these tools in the market that people create because of shortcomings in the Microsoft ecosystem, and then they tend to adopt that functionality. Things like a firewall. It used to be we all had to install firewalls in Windows because it didn't have one baked in like Linux did, and then they came out with one in 2008, for example. And then there's lots of little tools that over the years Microsoft has acquired or included that we used to have as third party. Well, IP address management is one of those, so you no longer have to use third party tools to do that. Dynamic access control allows for fine-tuning control over shared resources without the limitations of traditional file permissions. So this is sort of file permissions outside the scope of NTFS. DAC, by the way, is a term, you'll commonly hear DAC as far as access control. Usually it stands for discretionary access control, but here we're talking about dynamic access control, which is a feature in Microsoft Windows. It's not discretionary access control. In fact, DAC is probably more the opposite of discretionary access control, because in discretionary access control, a user is making decisions as to who can access files. But with dynamic access control, this is where the system administrator can assign permissions based on classifying files, which is more like mandatory or role-based or rule-based access control. So don't be don't be distracted by the DAC term. So it gives the administrator more flexibility in assigning resources or access to resources with Windows Server. I don't know how common dynamic access control is used. I've never used it, admittedly, but I'm sure it's a feature that some people obviously use, and we do talk a little bit about it in this course. So in this unit, I talked about a server being the software running on a computer hardware, and it's providing services to people on our network. We talked about 4 different editions of Microsoft Windows 2012, which was Data Center, Standard, Essentials, and Foundation. And I showed you that little chart that showed you the difference between those two that sort of summarized that, which you'll need for your assignment. We talked about how there are several features for creating and supporting the private cloud. So a lot of the newer features in 2012 are geared towards the private cloud. So we talked about that. The technologies that make up the core functionality were discussed in this unit, like the server manager, NTFS, Active Directory, the management console, disk management, and so forth and so on. So I talked about that core technology, and then I talked about the server roles that are available. I didn't talk about all of them, but I talked about some of the roles that are available in Microsoft Windows Server 2012. And then finally, we talked about some of the new features that are available in 2012. So some of the enhancements that are available now in 2012. And that concludes all of our material for Unit 1.